They were already laughing before I finished walking to the podium. I heard it before I saw it. A ripple of sound from the upper galleries of the conclave chamber. That particular kind of laughter that is not really laughter at all. It is a signal. A social weapon fired into a room to tell everyone present where the power sits. I had heard that sound in school hallways, in corporate boardrooms, and now, apparently, in the greatest diplomatic chamber in the known galaxy. I am Elias Vance. I was 34 years old, and I had been given a title that sounded important, but was not. Deputy Liaison for Human Affairs at the Veyrath Orbital Station, seat of the Galactic Conclave. What it meant in plain language was this. I was the person they sent when they did not want to send anyone who mattered. Humanity had been on probationary status with the Conclave for 11 years. That meant we could attend sessions but not vote. We could speak but not table motions. We could listen but not challenge. In a room of 47 species, we were the newest, the youngest, and by every measure the Conclave used to calculate worth, the least impressive. The other species had star charts older than our written history. They had diplomatic archives going back thousands of years. Some of them had been traveling between star systems before humans had figured out that the Earth moved around the Sun and not the other way around. They knew this, and they never let us forget it. I had taken this assignment because no one else on the human diplomatic roster wanted it. The previous 3 liaisons had come back from Veyrath Station, with filed stress reports and requests for reassignment. One of them, a woman named Gloria Firth who had spent 20 years in Earth's foreign service, had described the experience as, and I am quoting her directly, the most demoralizing professional engagement of my life. I was the 4th person to sit in that chair in 2 years. Nobody above me expected me to succeed. They expected me to survive the posting and come home with useful notes. I had been on the station for 9 days when it happened. The chamber was oval-shaped, enormous, and designed in a way that made every seat feel like it was slightly looking down at the central floor. It was not a subtle design choice. Every species had a raised arc of seats, and the arc's height corresponded, more or less, to that species standing in the conclave. Humanity's arc was low. We were positioned near the entrance, which was either an insult or a practical arrangement, depending on who you asked. I had stopped asking. The session that morning was a routine one, a review of trade corridor agreements in the Outer Rim systems. I was not expected to speak. I was there to observe and file a summary report. I had my datapad open, my notes prepared, and a cup of something that the station's food processors claimed was coffee, but tasted like warm regret. Princess Sarah of the Veyrath Dominion arrived 12 minutes late, which was apparently a normal occurrence that no one commented on. She was 19 years old by human counting, though to be precise, the Veyrath measured age differently, and by their own calendar she was considered barely past childhood. She was tall, with pale silver-gray skin, and eyes the color of deep water, the kind of blue that has no warmth in it. She wore robes that cost more than the entire annual budget of humanity's conclave delegation. She moved the way people move when they have never once had to hurry for anyone. She sat in the highest arc in the chamber. Of course she did. The session continued. Trade corridors were discussed. Numbers were exchanged. I took notes and drank my not coffee and tried to look like I belonged there, which was something I had never fully mastered. It was during a recess, one of those 10-minute pauses where representatives stretch and talk quietly among themselves, that it happened. Princess Sarah had descended to the main floor. I was not sure why. She did not usually come down during recesses. She had attendants who handled communication on her behalf. But there she was, walking across the open floor of the chamber, and she stopped when she was approximately 15 feet from me. She looked at me, the way someone looks at an object they find mildly interesting, but not particularly valuable. Her voice was clear and precisely modulated, each word shaped with the careful control of someone who knew exactly how their voice carried in a room. She was also speaking in the common tongue, the conclave's universal language, which was not an accident. She wanted every species in that chamber to understand her without using a translation device. She said, "You are the new human, yes? The fourth one they have sent. I said yes. I kept my voice even. She tilted her head slightly. I have been reading about your species, as a study, not as a matter of concern. She paused to let that settle. Around us, I could feel attention shifting. Other representatives were listening, some pretending not to. Your average lifespan is approximately 80 years. Is that correct? I said that was about right. 80 years, she repeated, as though she were saying 12 days. My species lives for 400. The Arathi over there live for 600. The Solvendi have individuals who have been alive for over 1,000 years. She gestured around the room with the ease of someone giving a tour of something they owned. And yet your species came to this conclave and expected to be treated as equals. I find that remarkable. Not in an admiring way. In the way one finds a very small creature remarkable for believing it is large. A few representatives in the lower galleries made soft sounds. Not quite laughter. Something more measured. Appreciation, maybe. She was not done. Your technology is 2 centuries behind the conclave average. Your political history is, by any diplomatic standard, alarming. You spent most of your recorded existence in conflict with yourselves. You have only had faster-than-light travel for 40 years, which in galactic terms is not an achievement, it is an introduction. And you have come here, to this chamber, and asked to be heard. She looked at me with something that was not quite curiosity and not quite contempt. I am not mocking you personally. I simply find the premise of human relevance difficult to locate. The chamber was quiet, in the way rooms get quiet, when everyone is deciding whether what just happened is acceptable. I looked at her for a moment. She held my gaze with the complete comfort of someone who had never once been wrong about anything, as far as she knew. Then I picked up my datapad from the desk beside me. I straightened my jacket. I did not say anything. I did not make a face. I did not take a breath that anyone could read. I simply turned, and I walked toward the chamber exit, and I did not look back. Not one word. The doors opened automatically as I approached and closed behind me, and I stood in the corridor outside the conclave chamber on Veyrath Orbital Station, and I breathed the recycled station air, and I listened to the absolute silence on my side of those doors. Then, faintly, from inside, the chamber began to murmur. Not laughter this time. Something different, confused, uncertain. I walked to the end of the corridor and sat down on a bench near a viewport that looked out at nothing but stars and the distant curve of a gas planet, and I thought very carefully about what I had just done, and whether it was the right call, and I decided it was. Because here is the thing about being mocked in public. There are only 2 responses that a room remembers. The first is fighting back, which confirms that you are emotional and reactive, which is exactly what they think you are. The second is silence and departure, which does something entirely different. It makes them wonder. It makes them question. It puts the weight of the moment not on you, but on them. I had not walked out because I was angry. I had walked out because I was thinking 3 moves ahead. Back on Earth, when I was a kid, my father used to say that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. He had been a quiet man who worked long hours and never raised his voice at anyone, but when he spoke, people listened. I had spent a long time figuring out why. It was because he never wasted words. When he used them, you knew they meant something. I thought about that on the bench by the viewport. I thought about how much of human history is the story of people being underestimated, people being told they were too small, too young, too new, too rough around the edges, and then those same people building something that outlasted every person who had said so. We did not need 400 years to matter. We had 80, and we used every single one of them. My comm unit buzzed. It was the head of the human delegation back on the station's residential block, a man named Arthur Cole, 58, former ambassador to 3 different Earth nations before he went into space diplomacy. His message was short. Get back here. Now. I stood up, straightened my jacket again, and started walking. I passed a viewport on my left that showed the stars stretching out in every direction, cold and ancient and enormous. I was not afraid. I was thinking. And in my experience, That is always the more useful thing to be. Arthur was standing when I walked in, which meant he was worried. Arthur Cole only stood when he could not sit still, and Arthur could almost always sit still. He was one of those people who had developed physical stillness as a professional skill, the kind of stillness that made other diplomats uncomfortable, because they could never tell what he was thinking. Seeing him on his feet told me more than anything he had said in his message. There were two other people in the room. One was Petra Hollis, our communications officer, a woman of 41 with short brown hair, and the tired eyes of someone who had been monitoring conclave feeds since before breakfast. The other was a young man I had met only twice, named Oliver Rains, our junior analyst, 26, and brilliant, and always slightly too eager to speak in rooms where speaking first was a disadvantage. Arthur pointed at a chair. I sat. "Walk me through what happened," he said. So I did. I told him about the recess, about Sarah coming to the floor, about what she said, word for word. I was careful to be accurate because I knew that what I said next would be judged partly on whether I had understood the situation correctly, and I had. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Oliver was the one who spoke first, because of course he was. "You walked out," he said. "You just walked out, without saying anything." "Yes." Of a Veyrath Royal's address. It was not an address. She was not at a podium. She was making personal remarks during a recess. "That distinction," Arthur said carefully, "may not matter to the conclave." "It matters to me," I said. "And I think it will matter to a few others, when they have time to think about it." Petra had her fingers on her tablet, scrolling. The station feeds are already running commentary. 3 conclave networks have flagged the incident. The Arathi Observer Program is describing it as an uncharacteristic display of composure from the human delegation. She looked up. "That is not a bad thing, for the record." Arthur finally sat down. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way he did when he was organizing his thoughts. "The Veyrath office has sent a formal query," he said. "They are asking whether the human delegation intends to file a complaint regarding the princess's remarks." "No," I said immediately. "Why not?" "Because filing a complaint makes us the injured party who needed official protection. That is the opposite of what just happened in that chamber." Arthur looked at me steadily. "What did just happen in that chamber, Elias?" I thought about how to say it clearly. A 19-year-old, regardless of her title, made a public speech designed to reduce a human representative to something the room could dismiss. And the human representative declined to participate in that reduction. He did not argue. He did not show distress. He simply removed himself from the situation, which communicated, very clearly, that the situation was beneath his engagement. I paused. That is not a defeat. That is a statement. Oliver leaned forward. But we do not have the standing to make that kind of statement land. We are on probation. The room does not respect us enough for the silence to read the way you want it to read. Not yet, I said. But they are wondering about it right now. And wondering is the beginning of paying attention. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Outside the room's single viewport, the station's slow rotation brought a different angle of stars into view. The light was faint and very old. "The Veyrath Dominion," Arthur said finally, "controls 9 votes in the conclave. They are allied with 4 other major species blocks. If they decide to push for an early review of our probationary status, they can do it within the next session cycle. That means we could be looking at an expulsion vote within 60 days. "I know," I said. "And you still think walking out was the right move?" "I think responding would have been the wrong one," I said. "Those are not the same thing. Walking out was not a strategy for winning a debate. It was a strategy for changing what the debate is about. Right now, every representative in that chamber is asking why the human walked out instead of arguing. They are assigning him qualities, restraint, calculation, maybe arrogance, but arrogance of a kind they have not seen from us before. We are not the embarrassed newcomer who flinched. We are the unknown quantity who surprised them." Petra set her tablet down. "The Loreth delegate sent a private query to our channel. She is asking if you would be available for an informal meeting." I looked at her. The Lorath were a quiet species, small block, 3 votes, perpetually overshadowed by the Veyrath and their allies. They had been in the conclave for over 2 centuries, and had very little to show for it. What time? She suggested this evening, station time, 1900. Tell her yes. Arthur watched me. You already know what you are doing, do you not? It was not quite a question. I have an idea, I said. Whether it works depends on things I cannot control. But the first step was this morning, and that is done. He nodded slowly. I need to send a report to Earth. What do you want me to say? Tell them the human delegation is engaged and stable, and that the situation is developing as planned. Oliver made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Is it developing as planned? It is developing as I hoped, I said, which is close enough. I left the meeting room and walked the corridor back toward my quarters, passing a row of viewports on my left. The station hummed with the business of 47 civilizations going about their daily work. I could hear it even through the walls, a kind of layered sound, different frequencies, different languages, different levels of urgency. The Lorath delegate's name was Yeva Suer. I had read her file twice when I first arrived, and found it interesting for the same reason I find most things interesting. Not what was in it, but what was missing. She had been in the conclave for 30 years. She had filed more formal objections to Veyrath motions than any other single representative. Every one of them had been voted down. She kept filing them anyway. That told me something about who she was. There were 2 other delegates I had been watching since I arrived. One was the representative from the Tev Collective, a species that communicated in layered color shifts and sound pulses, but whose translator feeds were remarkably precise. Their name in common tongue was rendered as Delegate Oros. They had voted against every motion that extended Veyrath trade exclusivity over the past 5 sessions. Quietly, without comment, but consistently. The other was a representative from a species called the Mirren, small, cautious, deeply private. Their delegate had not spoken in open session once in the 11 months I had reviewed records for. But their abstention record was a document of resistance in its own right. Every time a Veyrath-backed motion pushed for centralized conclave authority, the Mirren abstained, every single time. Nobody talked to the Mirren delegate. The records suggested they preferred it that way. I was going to talk to the Mirren delegate. Not tonight. Tonight was the Lorath meeting, which was the easier of the 3 conversations I intended to have. The Lorath wanted to be seen. They had been invisible for too long and they were tired of it, in the way that patient people get tired. Slowly, completely, and without any of the drama that would make others notice. I reached my quarters and sat at my desk, and pulled up the files I had been building since I arrived. Not the official conclave records. Those were useful but limited. What I had been collecting, quietly and carefully, was something else entirely. Art. Music. Literature. Public broadcasts. The kinds of things that diplomatic briefings never include, because they are considered irrelevant to political analysis. But I had learned something in my years of working in human foreign affairs, something that every great human diplomat, and every great human novelist, and every great human leader had understood before me. If you want to know what a civilization truly values, do not read their laws. Read their stories. Listen to their songs. Look at what they celebrate, and what they grieve, and how they express the difference. I had been doing that since before I boarded the ship to come here. I had been doing it for every species in the conclave, building a picture that no briefing document had ever tried to draw. And what I had found, buried in the public creative output of the Veyrath Dominion over the past 3 decades, was something that no political analyst had flagged, because political analysts do not look at art. The Veyrath were afraid. Not of external threats, not of war or economic collapse, something quieter and more fundamental. Their younger generations, and by younger I mean anyone under 150, were producing creative work saturated with a specific kind of despair. Not the loud despair of crisis, the quiet despair of meaninglessness. Of a civilization that had achieved everything it set out to achieve and did not know what to want next. A species with 400 years to live and nothing left to reach for. I had not filed this observation in any official report. I had sat with it. I had let it shape how I moved through the station, how I listened in sessions, how I watched Princess Sarah when she spoke. She was 19. She had grown up in that despair without having a name for it. She had been trained to project dominance, because dominance was the only language her civilization still spoke with confidence. She was sharp and quick, and she had a gift for reading rooms that was frankly impressive for someone her age. But she had mocked me for having only 80 years to live, without once considering what I might have learned about living urgently in a world that does not give you time to be careful. She had made an error. Not a political one, a human one. She had assumed that what she could not imagine, I could not possess. I opened my file on the Veyrath's cultural archives and started reading again. Not for intelligence, for understanding. Because understanding, in my experience, is the only currency that never loses its value. The meeting with Yevasur went well. She was a careful woman, deliberate in the way of someone who had been burned by carelessness and had decided never to be careless again. She did not mention the incident in the chamber directly for the first 20 minutes. She talked about trade, about route agreements, about the procedural calendar for the next session cycle. I listened and said the right things and did not push. Then she said, almost carefully, the princess's remarks were notable. They were, I said. Your response was also notable. I did not say anything to that. Yeva studied me across the table. She had deep brown eyes, and the kind of face that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. In 30 years at this station, she said slowly, I have watched many species respond to Veyrath condescension. Most argue. Some protest formally. A few become aggressive, which of course only confirms every assumption the Veyrath hold about them. She paused. No one has ever simply walked away. I did not want to have the argument they were expecting, I said. What argument were you expecting to have instead? I looked at her. A different one. A longer one. One that I intend to be part of. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, the Lorath Collective is interested in the stability of the conclave. We believe a healthy conclave is one in which no single block holds disproportionate influence over procedural outcomes. That seems like a reasonable position, I said. It is a position we have held for a long time, without notable effect. Perhaps, I said, that changes when more voices hold it. Yeva looked at me for a long moment. Then she picked up her cup and drank from it, which in Lorath custom I had read was a gesture of considered respect between equals. Not allies yet, but a step in that direction. I walked back to my quarters at 2200 station time. The corridor was quiet. Most of the station's population was in its rest cycle. I had 1 meeting down and 2 to go. I had 60 days before the probationary review. Somewhere on this station, Princess Sarah was in her quarters, and I imagined she was not thinking about me. I imagined she had moved on to other concerns, other sessions, other matters that a Veyrath royal considered worth her attention. That was fine. That was, in fact, exactly right. Because the best time to be underestimated is before you have done anything worth estimating. I sat at my desk and pulled up my notes and started writing. Not a diplomatic report. Not an intelligence summary. Something I had been writing since I was 12 years old. A letter to no one in particular, which was the way I had always sorted out what I actually thought about the world. I wrote, Today someone told me that my species is irrelevant because we do not live long enough to matter. I did not tell her that the length of a life has nothing to do with the weight of it. I did not tell her that the people I have loved and lost in my short human decades taught me more about meaning than a library of centuries ever could. I did not tell her any of that, because she was not ready to hear it. But she will be. I closed the document. I looked out at the stars. The gas planet was gone from view now, replaced by a field of nothing but deep black, and the cold fire of very distant suns. 80 years. That was what she had given me, as though it were a sentence. I thought about everything that fit inside 80 years, if you use them right. I thought about my grandfather who had fought in a difficult time at 19, and spent the rest of his life building things because he had seen enough destruction. I thought about my mother, who had written 4 novels and raised 2 children and learned to paint at the age of 61 because she decided she was not done learning. I thought about every human being who had ever been told they were too small or too short or too brief to matter, and had looked at that verdict and decided it was wrong. We were brief. We had always been brief. And we had always, every generation, somehow managed to pour everything we were into that briefness, so that it became not a limitation but a kind of fire. You do not understand fire, I thought, until you have needed it. Princess Sarah had 400 years ahead of her. I hoped, genuinely and without bitterness, that she would find something worth doing with them. But I suspected, based on everything I had read and observed and understood, that she was going to have to learn to see the world differently first. And I was, in my quiet and unhurried way, going to help her do exactly that. I was not expecting her to come herself. I was in the observation bay on Deck 7, the one that faced the open stretch of space between the station and the outer belt of asteroids that ringed the system. It was a long room, with a transparent wall from floor to ceiling, and nothing on the other side of it but distance. Most species on the station did not use it much. It was not a comfortable space. There were no seats designed for anyone but humans and 3 other bipedal species, and it required a special clearance code to enter because of some historical navigation concern that nobody had fully explained to me. I had gotten the clearance code on my 3rd day by asking the station's administrative office in the right tone of voice. That was another thing about being human that people underestimated. We ask for things. Constantly, cheerfully, without much shame about it. Other species, particularly the older ones, had complex systems of obligation and reciprocity that governed when you could and could not make requests. We just asked. It worked more often than it had any right to. I had been standing at the viewport for about 40 minutes, reading through the Mirren Cultural Archive on my datapad, when I heard the door open behind me. I turned around. Princess Sarah walked in alone. That in itself was unusual enough to require a moment's adjustment. In my 11 days on the station and 9 days of conclave sessions, I had never seen her go anywhere without at least 2 attendants within 10 feet of her, not because she needed protection. The station was extremely safe, but because Veyrath royals apparently did not move through common spaces unaccompanied. It was a matter of protocol so ingrained that nobody questioned it. She was questioning it now. She stopped about 8 feet from me. She was not wearing formal robes. She was dressed in something simpler, still expensive, still clearly Veyrath in design, but without the ceremonial layers. It made her look younger. Whether that was intentional, I could not tell. She looked at me with those deep-water eyes, and for a moment, she did not say anything at all. I waited. That was something I had learned early, from watching people who were better at conversation than I was. The person who breaks a silence first is usually the one who is more uncomfortable with it. I was not uncomfortable with silence. I had a lot of practice with it. Finally, she said, "You declined the invitation from my office." "I did," I said. "Why?" "Because the invitation was a summons with softer language," I said. And I did not feel that responding to a summons was the right move at this time. Something moved across her face. Not anger exactly. Something more like recalibration. She was adjusting her assessment of me in real time, and she was not entirely sure what to do with the new data. "You are very direct," she said. "I try to be," I said. "It saves time. And time, as you noted in the chamber, is something humans are acutely aware of." She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she moved to the viewport and stood beside it. Not beside me, but near it, facing the stars. I stayed where I was. "I came," she said, "because I want to understand something." "What do you want to understand?" "Why you walked away instead of responding." I considered how to answer that. There were several true answers, and I needed to choose the one that was most useful to both of us. "Because responding would have given you what you were expecting," I said. "And I do not believe in giving people what they are expecting, when what they are expecting is a way to dismiss me." She was quiet for a moment. "You think I was trying to dismiss you?" I think you were trying to dismiss the idea of human relevance in front of as many conclave representatives as possible during a recess, when they were all present and paying attention. I think you chose your words very carefully for that purpose. I think you are quite good at choosing words carefully. She turned her head slightly to look at me. That does not sound like a complaint. It is not one, I said. You are intelligent and you are skilled. I noticed that before the incident in the chamber. But? I did not say but. She turned to face me more fully. You were going to. I looked at her steadily. You made an error, I said. Not a tactical one, a more fundamental one. You assumed that knowing the measurements of my species, lifespan, technological level, political history, was the same as understanding us. It is not. Her chin lifted fractionally. And what would understanding you require? Reading our stories, I said, listening to our music, watching what we do when things fall apart, and what we build from the pieces. Not our diplomatic records, not our military history. The things we make when we are not trying to impress anyone. She studied me, with an expression I could not fully read. I have studied many species. I am quite familiar with the concept of cultural analysis. I know, I said. I have read your published work on the Arathi cultural transition of 400 years ago. It is impressive, genuinely. You have a very good analytical mind. I paused. But the Arathi were a civilization you studied from the outside. You did not have to reckon with them. You did not have to consider whether they might be capable of surprising you. I looked out at the stars for a moment. It is easier to be thorough about a subject you are not invested in. She was quiet. That was different from the silence at the start of our conversation. This was not a waiting silence. This was a thinking silence. I had seen it before, in people who were smart enough to hear something they had not expected, and honest enough not to immediately dismiss it. I pressed forward, carefully. Can I tell you something I have been observing since I arrived at this station? Not about humans, about the Veyrath. Her expression shifted toward caution. You have been here 11 days. I have been studying the Veyrath for 2 years, I said. Not from official briefings. From public sources. Art, literature, broadcast media, academic publications outside the diplomatic sphere. Things that do not make it into the kind of reports that diplomatic offices prepare. She did not tell me to stop, so I continued. The creative output of the Veyrath Dominion has shifted significantly over the past 40 years, I said. Not in quality. It remains extraordinary. But in character. The work being produced by your younger generations, and I mean the generation under 150, has a very specific quality to it. A kind of beautiful, aching emptiness. The Veyrath word for it, in your artistic criticism, is something that translates roughly into the common tongue as the weight of having arrived. I watched her face. A civilization that has achieved its goals and does not know what comes next. A people that is technically thriving, and privately uncertain about why. She was very still. I did not say anything else. I let her hold what I had just given her. Outside the viewport, the stars were unchanged. Indifferent in the best possible way. They did not care about conclave politics. They did not care about the gap between species' lifespans. They just burned, which was what stars did. How? She said finally, and her voice was different now, quieter, less constructed. Did you identify that? Because I grew up watching people who knew they did not have much time, I said. And what that does to a culture, when it goes on long enough, is teach people to be very good at recognizing meaning when it is missing. You develop a sensitivity to it, the way someone who has experienced hunger can recognize it in others even when it is well hidden. I looked at her. Your people are not lacking food or safety or achievement. They are missing something to reach for, and they do not have language for that feeling, because their entire civilization is built on the assumption that 400 years is enough time to find everything. She turned back to the viewport. She placed her hand against the transparent wall and looked at the stars, and did not speak for almost a full minute. I waited. I am not going to confirm or deny your analysis, she said at last. That would not be appropriate. That is fine, I said. But I want to know, she said, how a species with your lifespan has the confidence to come to a conclave of civilizations that are centuries older than you and attempt to be taken seriously. I thought about that, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to give her the real one and not the diplomatic version. Because we do not have the option of waiting, I said. Every human who has ever wanted to matter has had to decide to matter now, with whatever time they had. We have no choice but to reach, because if we do not reach, the time passes, and the moment is gone, and it does not come back. I looked at her. You have 400 years, Sarah. You can afford to be cautious. You can afford to wait for the right moment. We cannot. And because we cannot, we have spent our entire history learning to find the right moment and move before we are ready. I paused. That is not a weakness. That is a discipline, and it is one that your civilization, with all its wisdom and longevity, has not had to develop. She turned to look at me again. For the first time since the chamber, since I had known her even by observation, there was something in her expression that was not performance, not the careful construction of royalty, or the sharp efficiency of political intelligence. Something younger and less certain. I said things in that chamber that were intended to be reductive, she said, and then she stopped. I waited to see if she was going to say more. She did not say more along that line. That was fine. An apology was not what I needed from her. I know, I said simply. I did not expect you to walk away, she said. I know that too. It was, she said, carefully, unexpected. Good, I said. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she reached into the pocket of her jacket and took out something small, a folded piece of paper, which surprised me, because paper was unusual on the station. She held it for a moment, looked at it, then set it on the edge of the nearest surface between us. My aide found this in the public record archive, she said. A copy of a human poem. About time. She looked at me steadily. I found it more interesting than I expected. I did not pick it up. I looked at her instead. Did it answer any questions? It raised new ones, she said, which I understand, from my reading, is considered the mark of a good poem in human culture. Among other cultures too, I said. Questions are worth more than answers, most of the time. Answers close things. Questions keep them open. She looked at me with that expression I was still learning to read, the one that was not quite any single thing, but was a mixture of several things that were rearranging themselves into a new order. You are not what I was expecting, she said. I get that a lot, I said. She almost smiled. It was very small and very controlled, and it was there for only a moment before it was gone. But it was there. I imagine you do, she said quietly. Then, without another word, she turned and walked to the door and left. I stood at the viewport for a while after she was gone. The stars were the same. Everything else was different. I picked up the folded paper she had left. I opened it. It was a printed copy of a human poem about how fire burns brightest just before it goes out, and what it leaves behind is not darkness but warmth. A human poet had written it 100 years ago, thinking about nothing more than a cold winter evening. It had traveled somehow from that small human moment to a folder in a conclave archive, and then into the hands of a 19-year-old princess who had grown up in a civilization that did not understand why anyone would care about warmth when you had 400 years to generate it. I pulled up my datapad and sent a short message to Petra. Schedule the meeting with Delegate Oros for tomorrow morning. Add the Miran delegate for tomorrow afternoon if they will accept. Then I stood there a little longer, watching the stars, thinking about a young woman with 400 years ahead of her, who had just heard something that had reached past every wall she had built, and I hoped that it would keep reaching. Not for my sake, for hers. And also, if I am being honest, a little bit for the sake of what she might become when it did, because people who start asking real questions rarely stop, and a Veyrath royal who had learned to ask real questions was not a small thing in a galaxy where Veyrath royals had been providing all the answers for centuries. The paper was thin and slightly worn at the fold, which meant someone had opened and reread it more than once before bringing it here. I thought about that on the walk back to my quarters. I thought about it for a long time. Then I sat down at my desk and kept working, because the meeting with Delegate Oros was in the morning, and I had a great deal more to read before then. The message from Arthur came at 6 in the morning, station time, while I was still reading through the TEV Collective's session voting history, with a real cup of something that was closer to coffee than anything I had found on the station so far. The message said, Veyrath office has filed a formal notice. Conclave probationary review has been moved forward. New date, 42 days from today. I put down the cup. 42 days. They had shaved 18 days off the standard 60-day window. That was not a procedural adjustment. That was a statement. Someone in the Veyrath Dominion's political structure had decided that the situation needed to be resolved quickly and decisively, and the easiest way to resolve it was to remove humanity from the conclave before whatever momentum I might be building had time to build. They had underestimated how fast I could move, but they had also, by moving the date, told me exactly how worried they were. You do not accelerate a timeline unless you are afraid of what the original timeline might produce. They had seen something in that walkout. They were not sure what it was, but they recognized it as a threat to something they valued, and that recognition had made them act quickly instead of patiently. A civilization that acts quickly out of concern is a civilization that has started making mistakes. I finished my coffee and went to meet Delegate Oros. The TEV Collective's representative quarters were on the station's 4th level, which had a slightly different atmospheric composition to accommodate the TEV's preferred oxygen ratio. I had been cleared for the level before I arrived. I had requested clearance for every level on the station on my first day, which had confused the administrative office but which they had granted after reviewing my credentials. Being prepared was not exciting, but it paid off consistently. Delegate Oros received me in a meeting room that was very spare. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a single piece of TEV art on the wall that functioned as both decoration and a kind of mood communicator, shifting in color and texture in response to the emotional state of the room. When I walked in, it was a calm blue-green. As I sat down, it shifted slightly toward gold. Oros communicated through a translation device worn at their chest, which converted the TEV's natural color and sound language into common tongue. The voice it produced was precise and slightly formal, which I had been told was a translation artifact and not a reflection of Oros's personal communication style. You requested this meeting, Oros said. I did, I said. I appreciate the time. The TEV Collective is aware of the incident in the conclave chamber 2 days ago, Oros said. It was discussed. I imagined it was. The consensus among TEV observers was that your response was strategically sound, Oros said. The wall behind them shifted briefly to a flickering amber, which I had read was associated in TEV culture with cautious approval. We are not a species that values performative conflict. Neither am I said. The TEV Collective has voted against Veyrath proposed trade exclusivity motions 11 times in the past 6 years, Oros said, without preamble. We have not filed formal objections, because formal objections in this conclave are reviewed by a committee whose composition ensures they go nowhere. We have simply voted against. I noticed, I said. You noticed, Oros repeated. The wall shifted toward a curious orange. Most species do not look at the TEV voting record with that level of attention. I look at everything with that level of attention, I said. It is what I have instead of 400 years. There was a pause. The translation device rendered Oros's response with its usual precision, but I thought I heard something in the layered sound underneath it, something that might, in human terms, have been amusement. You make a habit of that remark. Only when it is the most accurate thing I can say. Oros oriented their forward sensory field in my direction, the TEV equivalent of a direct look. The conclave probationary review has been moved forward. Yes, I received notice this morning. 42 days is a short window, Oros said. It is, I said. But it is enough, if the right voices are heard before the vote. The TEV Collective's votes do not change outcomes. Oros said, and there was something in the translation that carried the weight of a long and frustrating history. We are 3 votes. The Veyrath bloc and their allies hold 26. Mathematics is not on the side of small blocks. Mathematics changes when you stop counting the same way everyone else is counting, I said. I leaned forward slightly. May I be direct with you? The Tev Collective prefers directness to the alternative, Oros said. I am not trying to defeat the Veyrath bloc, I said. I am not asking you to join a coalition against them. I am asking for something much simpler. I am asking for 3 votes in favor of keeping humanity's probationary status active, and I am asking for you to help me understand which other small block representatives might be willing to consider the same. Oros was still. The wall behind them held a steady, attentive green. Why would the Tev Collective do this? Oros asked. Because the question the Conclave is going to vote on in 42 days is not really about humanity, I said. It is about what kind of conclave this is. It is about whether this body exists to serve the development of all its members, or whether it exists to maintain the relative standing of those who were already powerful when it was founded. I looked at Oros steadily. That question matters to the Tev Collective. It has been mattering to you for 6 years and 11 votes. This is the first time there has been a case that makes it visible. The wall shifted slowly to a deep, contemplative blue. You have 42 days, Oros said. I know. And you believe you can change the outcome. I believe I can change what the outcome means, I said, which is different and longer lasting. Oros looked at me for a long moment. The Mirren delegate, they said. Have you spoken with them? I am meeting them this afternoon. The wall flickered briefly to something I had not seen before. A color between gold and green that my reference materials did not have a label for. The Mirren, Oros said, do not speak in sessions. They have not spoken in sessions for the past 11 months, but they have been paying attention. I know, I said. I have been reading their abstention record. Most people do not read abstention records, Oros said. Most people, I said, are not trying to do what I am trying to do. The meeting with the Mirren delegate was the strangest, and in some ways the most important conversation I had during those 42 days. The Mirren were small, physically smaller than any species in the conclave except the Solvendi, and where the Solvendi were simply slender, the Mirren had a quality of compactness that suggested something dense and deliberate about their construction. Their delegate's name, rendered in common tongue, was something close to Len. Len received me in quarters that were the warmest of any on the station. The Mirren apparently preferred a temperature that was just slightly above comfortable for every other species present, which I had decided was probably not an accident. Len did not speak. Not immediately. They watched me sit down and settle, and then watched me some more, and I sat with it and did not fill the quiet. We sat in silence for almost 4 minutes, which in human terms is a surprisingly long time to sit in silence with someone you do not know. And I simply waited, because I had done my research, and I knew that for the Mirren, this was not rudeness, it was assessment. Finally, Len said, in a very quiet voice through their translation device, "You read the abstention record." "Yes. No one reads the abstention record." "I know," I said. "That is why I read it." Len looked at me for a moment. "You want our vote." "I want your consideration," I said. "Whether that becomes a vote is up to you." "The Mirren do not make public statements," Len said. "A vote is not a public statement," I said. "A vote is a position. The two things are different. The conclave has been treating them as the same, which is part of why your abstentions have not accumulated into anything yet." Something shifted in Len's expression. Very small, very controlled, but present. "You are saying we should vote instead of abstain." "I am saying that the vote in 42 days is the one where abstaining and voting land in the same place as far as the outcome is concerned," I said carefully. "The motion needs a majority to pass. An abstention does not help it fail. A yes vote from you, though. A yes vote is a statement that the Mirren are willing to believe that a young species deserves the time to grow into something." I paused. "And I think that statement is one the Mirren have been waiting to make for a very long time. about themselves as much as about us. The room was very warm and very quiet. Len said, 11 months. Yes. That is how long we have been waiting for someone to look at us, Len said. Not at our resources, not at our trade routes, at us. I see you, I said. And I meant it. The next 38 days were the most intensive work of my professional life. I met with Yeva Sur 3 more times. I had 2 further sessions with Delegate Oros. I met with the representatives of 4 other small block species, carefully and without making any communication that could be formally characterized as vote lobbying, which was prohibited under conclave procedures for parties under probationary status. Everything I did was technically a conversation about ideas and not about political outcomes, and if those ideas happened to illuminate why a vote in favor of humanity's continued membership was also a vote for a more equitable conclave, that was a coincidence that nobody could prove. I barely slept. I sent long dispatches to Arthur every evening. I read everything I could find. I drank too much of the station's not coffee, and ate at irregular hours, and walked the station's corridors late at night, when most of the population was in its rest cycle, thinking through conversations, and working out what I should have said, and what I should say next time. I did not see Princess Sarah again during those 38 days. I heard about her. Her office issued a formal statement clarifying that the princess's remarks during the recess had been conversational, and not an official Veyrath position on human membership. That was interesting. It was not an apology, but it was a partial withdrawal, and a partial withdrawal from a Veyrath royal was not nothing. I filed it and kept moving. The session before the vote, Petra came to find me in my quarters at 9 in the evening. She sat down without being invited and put her tablet on the desk and said, I have been running the numbers. And? Best case, we get 7 yes votes from non-Veyrath species. We need 24 to carry a majority. She looked at me with the particular expression of a person who has done the math and found it unkind. Even if Yeva and Oros and the Mirren all vote yes, and even if the 3 others you have been talking to go our way, we are still not close. I know, I said. Then what are you planning to do? I looked at her for a moment. I am going to speak, I said. You have been given a 7-minute address window, she said. Before the vote. Standard probationary review protocol. 7 minutes, I said. That is plenty. She looked at me for a moment. Elias, what are you going to say? The truth, I said. Not a diplomatic version. Not a version designed to sound good in a conclave chamber. The actual truth about what humanity is, and what we are doing here, and why it matters. Petra was quiet for a moment. That is a risk. Everything is a risk, I said. The question is whether it is the right one. She looked at me for a long time. Then she nodded, once, and picked up her tablet and left. I sat alone at my desk and looked at the viewport for a while. The gas planet was back in view. The station's rotation had brought it around again. It was enormous and quiet, and did not care at all about what I was planning to say tomorrow. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about my mother. I thought about every human being who had ever been told they were not enough, and had decided to be enough anyway. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet and stubborn way that people decide things when they have no other option. I started writing. Not a speech, a letter. To the room, to the 47 species who would be in that chamber tomorrow, most of whom had never thought seriously about a human being in their lives, and were about to be asked to vote on whether we deserved to stay in theirs. I wrote until midnight. Then I stopped writing and read what I had. Then I cut most of it, because the best speeches are not long speeches, they are true ones, and the truth I needed to say did not require many words. I had 7 minutes. 7 minutes to say something that 47 civilizations had never heard before. 7 minutes to make a room full of ancient, patient, thoroughly self-assured species consider the possibility that a brief life might have something to teach a long one. I set the alarm and slept 4 hours, and woke up before it went off, the way you do when your body knows tomorrow matters more than sleep. Outside the viewport, the gas planet turned slowly in the dark, patient and permanent, and entirely indifferent to what happened next. I got dressed and went to face the chamber. The chamber was full. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in the next morning. Conclave sessions were frequently attended at somewhere between 60 and 80% capacity. Representatives sent aides, took remote feeds, handled other business during sessions they considered low priority. But a probationary review vote, particularly one that had been moved forward on short notice, was a different kind of session. Word had traveled. Everyone was present. I walked to the human delegation's arc, low, near the entrance as always, and sat down. Arthur was beside me, looking exactly as calm as he always did, which I now understood meant he was nervous. Petra was on my other side, running a final check on the session protocol feed. Oliver Raines was behind us, very still, which for Oliver meant he was either thinking hard or trying not to show how worried he was. The chamber filled around us. I watched species after species take their seats. I watched the Lorath delegation settle in their arc. I watched Delegate Oros arrive with 2 other TEV representatives. I saw the Mirren delegation, Len and a single aide, take their seats with the same quiet economy of movement they always used. I watched Princess Sarah enter last, as she always did, and take her place in the highest arc. She was in full ceremonial dress today, every inch of her the official representative of the oldest and most powerful civilization in the conclave. Her expression was composed and unreadable. She did not look at me. The session opened. The conclave chair, an ancient Arathi, named something that translated roughly as Voice of the Long Count, called the session to order, and outlined the agenda. Probationary review of the human delegation. Motion filed by the Veyrath Dominion to formally conclude humanity's probationary period. Conclude, in this context, did not mean graduate. It meant remove. The chair called for opening statements from the filing party. A senior Veyrath diplomat, not Sarah, which was interesting, gave a careful and thorough address covering every metric by which humanity fell short of full conclave membership standards. It was well prepared and accurate as far as it went. Technology gap, political instability index, years of interstellar experience, economic integration level. They had the numbers and they presented them cleanly. I listened and took notes and did not let my expression do anything that could be read. Then the chair called for any statements from member representatives before the vote. 3 species spoke, briefly, formally, in ways that were clearly prepared. 2 sided with the Veyrath position. 1, the Lorath delegate, said only that the conclave should consider carefully whether this vote reflected its founding purpose. Yeva sat down without elaborating. She did not need to. Then the chair said, "The human delegation has 7 minutes." I stood up. The room was very quiet. I walked to the speaker's position at the center of the chamber floor, the flat open space that all the arcs looked down on. I stood there for a moment without speaking, just long enough to feel the room settle its attention on me completely. Then I started. "I am not going to argue the numbers," I said. "The Veyrath delegation has them right. By every metric that this conclave uses to measure readiness, humanity falls short. That is accurate. I am not here to dispute it." I let that land for a moment. A few representatives shifted in their seats. They had been expecting a defense. "I want to talk instead about something that is not in the metrics," I said. "Something that I have been thinking about since I arrived on this station, and that I think is the only thing actually worth saying in the time I have been given." I looked around the room. Not at any one person, at the room. Every species in this chamber was, at some point, where we are now. Young, uncertain, not ready, by the standards of the civilizations that came before you. Every one of you had a moment in your history when you stood in a room that had been built by others who were older and more experienced, and you were told, in whatever way your particular history told you, that you were not yet enough. The room was very still. "Some of you were told gently," I said. "Some of you were told harshly. Some of you were not told at all, and simply felt it in the way the room turned toward you, and then turned away. It is a specific feeling, and if you have had it, You do not forget it, even when centuries have passed, and you have long since become the ones with the power, and the long history, and the elevated arc. I paused. The question this vote is really asking, I said, is not whether humanity is ready for the conclave. The question is whether the conclave is willing to believe in the potential of a species that has not yet become what it is going to become. Whether this body, which was founded on the principle of common progress, is willing to do the hard and uncertain thing of investing in something before the return is guaranteed. I let that sit for a breath. We have 80 years, I said. The princess reminded me of that 42 days ago, and she was right. 80 years is short. In galactic terms, it is almost nothing. And because it is almost nothing, every human who has ever lived has had to learn something that longer-lived species have had the luxury of not learning. How to care about things that will outlast you. How to build for a future you will not see. How to pour everything you are into something that does not promise you will be remembered for it. I let the room hold that. That discipline, I said, is not a consolation prize for having a short life. It is a form of wisdom, not better than the wisdom that comes from centuries of experience. Different from it. A different angle on the same universe. I looked up at the highest arc, and for just a moment, I met Sarah's eyes directly. And different angles are what make the picture complete. I did not rush what came next. I let the silence work for me. Humanity is not asking to be treated as your equals, I said. We are not. Not yet. We are asking to be treated as something you once were. A species at the beginning of a very long story. In a room where the people around them are already deep into their own. We are asking for the room to stay open. I looked around one final time. Because the beginning of a story is not nothing. It is where everything starts. And if you close the door on beginnings, the only stories left are the ones that are already ending. I walked back to my seat. The chamber was silent for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then the vote was called. I sat very still and watched the display above the chair's podium as the votes registered. The Veyrath bloc voted to conclude humanity's probationary status, as expected. Their primary allies followed, as expected. The numbers climbed on the wrong side of the ledger, and I watched them and kept my face entirely still. Then Yeva Sewer's vote registered. Continue. Then Oros. Continue. Then the Mirren bloc. Continue. 2 more small block votes came in as continue. Representatives I had spoken to briefly, carefully, about ideas and not outcomes, about the kind of conclave they wanted to be part of in the next century. The tally climbed on both sides now. It was not going to be enough. I knew the math. I had always known the math. 7 votes against 26 was not a victory by any count. But then the Veyrath Dominion's vote registered. Not conclude. Not continue. Abstain. The room shifted, audibly. The sound of 46 species processing something unexpected at the same moment. A low, surprised ripple that moved through the chamber like a wave. In 11 years of probationary reviews in the conclave, the Veyrath Dominion had never abstained. On anything. They led every coalition they were part of. They set the tone, and expected others to follow. Abstaining was not in their political vocabulary. It was practically not in their language. The word for it in Veyrath, as far as I could find, was a compound that roughly translated as, the refusal to be wrong yet. The tally finalized. The motion to conclude humanity's probationary status had not reached the required majority. Not because the yes votes had been beaten in a fair count, because the abstention had changed the math. A motion required a majority of votes cast in a direction. An abstention was not a vote cast. It was a removal of weight from the scale. The Veyrath had carried 26 votes into this chamber. They had used none of them. The chair called the result in a measured voice. Humanity's probationary status would continue for the standard review period. The room was buzzing now, not quiet. Buzzing in the way rooms buzz when something has happened that nobody entirely knows how to categorize. I heard fragments of it in a dozen languages and translation feeds. Words that meant unprecedented. Words that meant significant. Words that in several languages translated most closely as, wait, what just happened? Arthur leaned very close to me and said, quietly, an abstention from Veyrath. I did not see that coming. Neither did I said honestly. But I hoped. Oliver was already checking feeds. The Conclave networks are all running it as the lead. The Arathi Observer program is calling it historically significant. He looked up, his professional composure briefly abandoned. Elias, what did you say to the princess? I told her some things that were true, I said. I let her decide what to do with them. Petra put her hand briefly on my arm and did not say anything, which from Petra was a great deal. The chamber was beginning to move, representatives leaving their arcs, aides appearing from side doors, the usual organized movement of a session concluding. I stayed in my seat for a moment longer. I looked at the highest arc. Princess Sarah was still there. She was looking at the session display rather than at the room. Her expression was composed in the way that someone's expression is composed when they are working very hard at composing it, when composure is not a natural state, but an achieved one. She had made a choice today that no one in her position had made in 11 years of conclave history, and she had made it in a room full of the most politically attentive observers in the known galaxy, and it had changed the outcome. And she had done it without consulting anyone, without filing a notice, without the layers of procedure and approval that Veyrath political action always moved through. She had simply decided, and then she had done it. Whatever was behind her composed expression, it was not nothing. I was certain of that. I picked up my datapad and stood and walked out of the chamber into the corridor, and the station air was the same recycled air it always was, and the light was the same station light it always was, and everything was exactly as it had been this morning. Except that it was not. I was at the docking bay at 1400 the next day. My transit back to Earth did not leave until 1700, but I had never been good at waiting in rooms when there was somewhere to walk, and the docking bay on Veyrath Station was actually one of the more interesting places to spend a few hours. Ships came and went in patterns that told you a great deal about which species were meeting with which, and what the traffic in and out of the station revealed about the week's undercurrents. I had 2 bags. Everything I had brought fit into 2 bags, which Arthur had once described as almost alarmingly minimal for a diplomatic posting. I had told him I preferred to know I could leave quickly if I needed to. He had looked at me for a moment and said that he supposed that was one way to live, and I had told him it was the only way I knew how. Arthur had said goodbye to me that morning, with a handshake that lasted a moment longer than a standard handshake, which from Arthur was the equivalent of a full speech. Petra had given me a proper hug and told me that she hoped I got some actual sleep on the transit home. Oliver had shaken my hand and immediately started asking whether I thought the abstention set a precedent that would affect the next session cycle, which was exactly what I would have expected from Oliver, and which I found comforting in its consistency. I was reading the ship departure schedule on the bay's public display when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Princess Sarah was standing at the entrance to the docking bay. She was, again, alone. No attendants. She was dressed in something practical, in the gray-blue that seemed to be a color the Veyrath associated with informal occasions. She walked to where I was standing and stopped about 6 feet away. We looked at each other. "You are leaving," she said. "My assignment here is complete," I said. She nodded, once, as though confirming something she had already known. I waited. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want to be clear that this is not a formal statement, and it is not intended for any record or report." "Understood," I said. She looked at me with those deep-water eyes, and there was something in them today that had not been there 42 days ago in the chamber. Not softness exactly. The Veyrath were not a soft people, and Sarah was not a soft person. But something that had been locked behind the surface was closer to it now. Something that looked, if I was reading it correctly, like the particular discomfort of a genuinely intelligent person who has discovered they were wrong about something significant and is still working out what to do with that discovery. "I did not think silence could be loud," she said. I waited. "The walkout," she said. "I spent 2 days trying to decide what it meant before I came to find you in the observation bay. I went through every framework my education gave me for reading political behavior, and none of them gave me a category for it." A pause. I eventually concluded that you had done something I did not have a name for, because I had not been taught to expect it from a human representative. What did you eventually call it? I asked. She looked at me steadily. Choice, she said. You chose the response that cost you the most in the short term, and gained you the most in a term that was not yet defined. That is not an instinct. That is a practice. She paused again. I have been taught that humans are reactive, impulsive, that your short lives make you poor strategists because you cannot think far enough ahead. And now, I said. Now I think, she said slowly, that I was taught by people who had never spent significant time watching a human decide what not to do. I looked at her for a moment. Can I ask you something? Yes. The abstention, I said. Was that you, or the Dominion? She held my gaze without flinching. The Dominion deferred to my recommendation on this vote, she said, which is within my authority as the senior representative present. And your recommendation was that the motion as filed was premature, she said, and that premature conclusions are poor governance. I studied her. That is a defensible position. It is the position I held, she said. The reasoning behind it is my own business. Of course, I said. We stood in the quiet of the docking bay for a moment. A ship from the Arathi delegation was moving through the bay on its approach path, enormous and silent, the kind of ship that had been carrying its species between stars for longer than human civilization had been writing things down. Sarah reached into the fold of her jacket and took something out. It was the book, the battered paperback I had left with her in the observation bay, a copy of a novel that my mother had pressed into my hands before I boarded the ship to come here, saying only, "Take this, you will need something real to read." It was a human story about ordinary people in an ordinary place, who kept making the wrong decisions for the right reasons, and kept trying anyway. I looked at the book, and then at her. I read it, she said. I did not say anything. I did not understand all of it, she said. The cultural references are specific in ways that my translation context could not always resolve, but I understood enough. She paused, and for just a moment something moved across her expression that was less controlled than anything I had seen from her across 6 weeks on this station. The character in the 3rd chapter, she said. The one who rebuilds the house after the storm. He knows it may flood again. He builds it anyway. Yes, I said. I read that section 4 times, she said. I took the book from her hand. It was warm. She had been holding it for a while. Your address, she said. In the chamber. You said that the beginning of a story is where everything starts. I said that, yes. She looked at me. My civilization, she said, carefully, is very far from its beginning. I met her eyes. That is not a reason to stop reading new ones. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and it was the smallest thing she had said in any conversation we had, the most genuinely unguarded. I have a lot to learn, do I not? It was not quite a question. It was the thing people say when they have arrived at a real thought and are not entirely sure what to do with it yet. But they have said it out loud, and that is the first step. Everyone does, I said. That is not a condition of youth. That is a condition of being alive. She nodded. She looked at the book in my hands for a moment. Then she turned to leave and stopped after 2 steps, which was a very human thing to do, and which I noticed and found quietly remarkable. She said, without turning around, do humans have a word for the feeling of being wrong about something important and being grateful for it? I thought about it. Humility, I said, though we are inconsistent practitioners of it. She turned her head slightly, enough to suggest she was considering that. Then she walked back through the entrance to the docking bay and was gone. I stood there for a while with the book in my hand. The transit ship home was large and comfortable and had real coffee, which I discovered approximately 15 minutes after boarding, and which improved everything considerably. I found a seat by the observation port, which looked out at the station as we pulled away. That enormous wheel of metal and light turning slowly in the dark, carrying 47 civilizations worth of ambition and history, and daily work and quiet hope. It got smaller as we moved away from it. It did not stop being there. I opened the book. I found the page with the rebuilt house. I read it again, not for the first time and not, I suspected, for the last. Outside, the stars were doing what they always did, which was shine without asking whether anyone was watching. I had 80 years, roughly 46 left, if the odds were with me. That was not much, in galactic terms. In human terms, it was a great deal. Enough to do something with. Enough to mean something. Enough to write one more chapter in a story that had started before me and would continue long after. I thought about Yevasur, who had spent 30 years filing objections that went nowhere and was still filing them when I arrived. I thought about Delegate Oros, who had voted against concentrated power 11 times in quiet and had been waiting for a room where the quiet could be heard. I thought about Len of the Mirren, who had not spoken in open session for 11 months and had watched everything and remembered all of it. I thought about all the voices that had been quietly present in that conclave chamber for years, waiting for a moment when speaking up felt like it would land somewhere that mattered. I had not won, not in any complete sense. Humanity was still on probation. We were still the newest, the youngest, the least experienced species in that chamber. We still had decades of work ahead before any of those metrics changed, and decades in human terms meant the rest of my career and then some. But something had shifted, and shifts are how things change. Not the sudden dramatic moments, those come later, and people call them turning points without noticing that the actual turning happened quietly, before anyone was paying attention, in observation bays and informal meetings and conversations that were officially about ideas and not outcomes. A 19-year-old with 400 years ahead of her had read a human novel 4 times and come to a docking bay alone to return it. An ancient conclave with thousands of years of procedural history had recorded its first Veyrath abstention. 3 small block species had voted yes to something they would have stepped away from a month earlier. Small things. All of them small things. All important things begin as small things. I turned to the next page. Outside the observation port, the station was now small enough to look like a bright point against the dark, distinguishable from the stars only by the fact that it moved slightly against them as we pulled away. I watched it until I could not tell it apart from the rest of the light out there. Then I turned back to the book. We were brief. We had always been brief. And we had always, every generation without exception, found a way to make briefness matter. Not by pretending it was something else. Not by wishing for more time, but by deciding that the time we had was enough to do the thing that needed doing. 80 years. That was what we were given. That was what we had always been given. I thought about what I would say when I got home. I thought about sitting across from the people who had sent me on this assignment and finding words for what had actually been accomplished, which was not the thing you could put in a metric or chart on a display. I was going to tell them this. I went to a room where no one expected us to do anything interesting, and I made them wonder about us. Not fear us. Not respect us yet, not fully. But wonder. And wonder is the first thing that happens before everything else. I was going to tell them that a young woman with 400 years of life ahead of her had read a human story 4 times and come to a docking bay alone to say something honest. And that one honest conversation, in my experience, is worth more than any number of tactical victories, because honesty changes people, and tactical victories only change positions. I closed my eyes. Outside, the stars were patient and permanent, and doing what stars do, which is burn for as long as they can, and leave light behind when they are done. That seemed, to me, like exactly the right way to live. I slept all the way home.